All right, y'all, it's Antiwar Radio, Chaos 92.7 FM in Austin.
You know, the use of the military. There's some people who are now suggesting that if you don't want to use the military to maintain the peace, to do the civil thing, is it time to consider a civil force of some kind that comes in after the military that builds nations or all of that? Is that on your
I don't think so.
radar screen?
I think what we need to do is convince people who live in the lands they live in to build the nations. Maybe I'm missing something here. I mean, we're going to have kind of a nation-building corps from America? Absolutely not. Our military is meant to fight and win war. That's what it's meant to do. And when it gets overextended, morale drops. But I'm going to be judicious as to how to use the military. It needs to be in our vital interest, the mission needs to be clear, and the exit strategy obvious. I think what we need to do is convince people who live in the lands they live in to build the nations.
All right, everybody, that was Governor George Bush in the debate on PBS with Al Gore back in the year 2000. And that's an example of him talking about that humble foreign policy we remember so well from the early days of the Bush administration before 9/11 changed everything. Well, here to discuss conservatism and foreign policy is Michael Ostrolenk. He's founder and president of the American Conservative Defense Alliance and the co-founder of the Liberty Coalition. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for having me today.
It's very good to have you here. And I guess I'm just curious, so what goes through your mind when you listen to George Bush protesting how ridiculous it is, the idea, am I missing something here? Why should we go and nation build all over the world?
Well, it's interesting because if you listen to the rhetoric of someone like Woodrow Wilson or FDR or George Bush, they actually all opposed intervention. And then you see what they actually did when they're in office. So I would suggest that when politicians such as themselves open their mouths, you should expect the opposite in terms of their actions once they're in office.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we're focusing on the right this hour because in the next hour we'll be talking with Robert Dreyfuss about what a warmonger Barack Obama is from the left there. So, first of all, the website, is acdalliance.org. Yeah, there you go. And that's the American Conservative Defense Alliance. And you have this article here, 10 reasons why conservatives should oppose war with Iran. And this is, of course, top priority on this show. And so I especially like to see the argument coming from a self-identified conservative point of view here. So I figure we would just get started and go down the list here. First thing you do is invoke Russell Kirk, who's considered the founder of modern American conservatism, and his position that war should always, only, ever be the last resort.
Exactly, Scott. We have 10 reasons, and the first one is the one you just discussed. You know, from our point of view, from conservatives' point of view, or I should say traditionally conservatives' point of view, we should only be involved in military operations that directly affect the United States. When we are threatened, we should be able to, in terms of self-defense, engage militarily with other countries. In this case, Iran is not a threat to the United States. They have not crossed the Mexican and Canadian border. When it comes to Iraq and Afghanistan, I know there's been claims by the administration that they are arming and threatening us in both countries. But I think if you look at the facts as I know them at this time, in fact, the Iranians have been helpful with our efforts, especially in the beginning of our efforts in Afghanistan. And they have interest in stability in Iraq. So I would question and ask for evidence that the Iranians are actually a threat to U.S. forces in both countries.
Yeah, well, I think that's very important that you would even stop to say, well, wait a minute, is that true? Because I think a lot of people repeat that. They hear it a few times and they assume it must be true. But in Iraq and Afghanistan both, their interest, other than being wary of what we might do to them in the future, their immediate interest is in supporting Hamid Karzai against the Taliban and in supporting the Dawa Party and the Supreme Islamic Council in power in Iraq.
Exactly right, Scott. And actually, I do remember probably about a year ago, some claims were made by the U.S. that the Iranians were arming and encouraging rebellion against the U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And within 24 hours, one of their defense ministers, the Afghani defense ministers, came out and said, qualified, no, that's actually not true. And I know the same claims have been made on and off, especially with the explosive devices being used against U.S. and coalition forces in Iraq as well. And I think the evidence has supported that those allegations are not true. And it's not to say that there might be some legitimacy to some of the concerns about Iranians in Iran, funneling arms and equipment to forces in Iraq. But we have to be really careful. First of all, we need evidence. Then we have to be really careful to determine whether it's the Iranian government and or just individuals within, the Iranian population, whether they're criminal elements doing such things, and, in fact, what interest do they have, whether it's the Iranian government or criminal elements or just interested Iranian citizens in arming such groups, because maybe those groups are providing a service that, although are contrary to our troops on the ground's interests, provide a service to the individuals in Iraq, the Shiites, in protecting themselves against perhaps Sunnis or other Shiite forces.
Well, let me ask you this. If we could take at face value whatever David Petraeus said about this and just believe that the Iranian government is directly behind the funneling of explosives to Shiite militias like Sadr's Mahdi army for use against American soldiers, would that amount to a casus belli in your eyes?
I would have to say no, because if you look back historically, there's been many instances, including our own, of supplying weapons and training and arms to various indigenous forces. And yet we would scream at the top of our lungs if the main country involved in that particular location declared war on us and went to war with us. These covert activities are going on all the time. We support, they support, all these groups are involved in supporting one another over time. Our present-day enemies are our allies become our enemies, all that kind of stuff. So we have to be really careful of conflating covert activities that could be harmful, and we have to be aware of them, and I ask for evidence. Conflating that with war, we should not go down that path.
You keep using this phrase, really careful. Is that part and parcel of conservatism to you?
Well, Reagan said we should trust but verify. I suggest that we don't trust but verify. Yeah, I think conservatives have to be very conservative. Kind of goes with the term. And just be really careful on decisions that are taken, hopefully in our own interests, and look down at the possible consequences of any decisions. And obviously, we're infallible as human beings. That's another tenet of conservatism. So we don't always know the consequences of our actions. That's why it's best to be very careful in deciding what we want to do, especially when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, just the kind of language, just sort of in the general sense, that we haven't heard from the right, and, well, at least since the last time they didn't control the presidency.
Yes, and actually I would suggest that in most cases, when you hear it from the right, especially in the past 50 years, it's mostly been rhetorical, because unfortunately when they come to power, their rhetoric and their actions are dissimilar.
Well, we can kind of take these out of order and just sort of go through them. One thing I wanted to kind of pick a fight with you about was, toward the end there, you sort of imply that it seems like it goes without saying that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons, and you say that, if we bomb them, that could be ineffective and maybe even increase their drive for nuclear weapons and so forth. But the CIA and 15 other intelligence agencies said last November that they had abandoned all efforts at creating nuclear weapons, even such as they were, back in 2003.
Right. And actually, I'd ask this as a question because I don't have an answer. Why do we think that they were actually seeking nuclear weapons prior to 2003?
Well, as far as I know, it's all based on the so-called smoking laptop, which we know it came from the National Council for Resistance in Iran, which is the political front for the Mujahideen al-Khalq and a front for Israeli intelligence. I don't think anybody's ever proven the laptop even came from inside Persia anywhere. And what it says in there is, at least as far as I know, two not very credible allegations. One, that they were going to build a laser enrichment facility to enrich their uranium ore up to uranium tetrafluoride, which makes no sense because they can already get it to uranium hexafluoride stage, which is what you need to introduce it into your centrifuges at the factory they have right down the street, that they already had, that is safeguarded by the IAEA, and that they're churning the stuff out. And then the other thing was, supposedly they were working on a delivery vehicle for a nuclear warhead for a missile, but even David Albright, the discredited so-called nuclear physicist, who is usually the guy beating the drum about all this stuff, wrote letters complaining to the New York Times that this just didn't make any sense because if this delivery vehicle is what they said it was, you couldn't fit a nuclear bomb in that anyway.
Right, and actually, I will like to go back and answer your question. because I actually didn't answer it when you asked. From what I understand, everything you just said is accurate. So, and once again, I just kind of put out a question about the assessment that 2003 they're interested in nuclear weapons, and perhaps they were, but I need to see evidence.
Yeah, well, you know, my favorite expert on this is Gareth Porter.